It was just another quiet Sunday afternoon when my son, Jake, came inside looking confused and a little rattled. He'd just finished locking up our backyard pool gate, like he always does after a swim, when suddenly a woman he'd never seen before started yelling from the other side of the fence. Apparently, she wanted to take a dip uninvited and without even asking us first. She claimed the pool was for the community, even though the pool is clearly in our private backyard, surrounded by a locked fence and posted signs. Jake, being 14 and a rule follower, did exactly what he was taught. He told her she couldn't come in and locked the gate. That's when things got really strange. Within minutes, the woman, who we later found out lives a few blocks down, whipped out her phone and called 911, reporting that a minor had trapped her outside a public pool. We watched in disbelief as she stood outside the gate, phone to her ear, pretending to be the victim of some major injustice. And just like that, sirens. Officers pulled up in front of our house, lights flashing, and before we could even explain the situation, Karen, as we came to call her, had already spun a tale that made Jake out to be some kind of little tyrant. What happened next completely caught us off guard. The police started asking us questions about the pool, about Jake's actions, and even whether we had proper signage, all because someone felt entitled to our space. The whole neighborhood started peeking out from behind blinds. And right when we thought it couldn't get more ridiculous, Karen said something that stopped everyone in their tracks. You won't believe what came out of her mouth next and how it changed everything in a matter of seconds. Karen, still clutching her phone, pointed at Jake and loudly claimed he had locked her out intentionally to harass her. The officer looked from her to my son, clearly unsure what to make of the situation. I stepped forward, trying to stay calm, and explained that the pool was on our private property. I told them Jake had just finished swimming and did what he's always been told: lock the gate behind him when he's done. The fence wasn't some community amenity. It was our own safety measure. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. She insisted she'd been using the pool for months while we weren't home, and that she had every right to continue. My jaw dropped. I had no idea someone had been sneaking into our backyard like that. We never gave her or anyone permission. The pool is surrounded by a tall wooden fence with a gate that stays locked for safety, especially with Jake and his younger cousins often playing nearby. The idea that someone had been climbing over or somehow getting in behind our backs made my stomach turn as the officers took notes. Karen went on about how the neighborhood used to be friendly and how she had always had access before. Her tone shifted between entitled and emotional, and one of the officers seemed to be buying it. Jake stood beside me silently, visibly upset, unsure what he'd done wrong. I could feel my blood boiling, but I knew I had to keep cool. Then Karen suddenly mentioned she knew the HOA president personally, and said there were rules about shared spaces. But the thing is, we don't even belong to an HOA. We bought this home specifically to avoid all of that. So where was she getting this idea from? Something wasn't adding up, and the more she spoke, the more it felt like she was hiding something. I stood there stunned as Karen kept going on about shared community resources and claimed she had used the pool during the previous owner's time. But we'd lived in this house for almost 5 years, and not once had we allowed outsiders into our backyard, let alone strangers hopping the fence when we weren't home. The officers seemed caught between two completely different stories. I offered to show them the property papers to prove it was privately owned. One officer nodded and followed me inside, while the other stayed outside with Karen, who had now pulled out her phone and started filming. That's when things took another weird turn. One of our neighbors, Mr. Allen, walked over slowly from across the street. He's lived on the block even longer than us, and he's the kind of guy who notices everything. Without me asking, he told the officers that Karen had a history of poking around people's yards when they weren't home. Said he'd even caught her once checking his side gate, though she claimed she was looking for her cat. Suddenly, Karen's story wasn't holding up so well, but she didn't flinch. She pivoted fast, saying she had verbal agreements with previous owners that allowed her access. She even claimed she had family ties to the builder who helped develop this part of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Jake sat quietly on the porch, still shaken, and my wife came outside to check what was happening. She had no idea someone had been sneaking into our space either, so we pieced everything together. Another neighbor chimed in. Apparently, Karen had done something similar at another home on the next block just walked into someone's backyard and acted like it was hers. It was becoming clear this wasn't just a one-off misunderstanding, but what was her end game? Why was she so determined to access our pool, and why now? Something deeper was going on, and we were just starting to see the cracks in her story as the officers returned from inside. Holding the property papers I'd handed them, the tension in the air grew thicker. Karen's confident expression began to flicker, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. I noticed her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched her phone, still recording everything. The officers shared a quiet exchange, glancing back at us and then at Karen, who now seemed a little less sure of herself. Suddenly, Karen raised her voice, accusing us of being hostile and making false claims about her. She insisted that the pool was a community resource and that she had every right to swim there whenever she wanted. Her tone turned desperate, like she was clinging to something that was slipping away. I glanced at Jake, who was gripping the porch railing, his face pale but determined. He hadn't said a word since this started, but now I could see the frustration and fear in his eyes. Then, out of nowhere, Karen dropped a bombshell. She claimed she had evidence messages and recordings that proved previous owners had allowed her to use the pool freely. She said she was prepared to show the officers right then and there. The crowd that had gathered on the street leaned in closer, whispering among themselves. Even the officers looked intrigued, though cautious. At that moment, my wife stepped forward and asked if Karen had ever asked us for permission, but Karen just shook her head and smiled slyly. That's when things started to spiral. The officers warned that if there was proof of trespassing or harassment, it could lead to legal trouble. Karen, instead of backing down, doubled down. Her voice grew louder, and she demanded access, saying she wasn't leaving until she got what she wanted. It felt like everything was about to explode. The calm neighborhood street had turned into a battlefield over a locked pool gate, and no one knew how it would end. The sun was dipping low, shadows stretching across the fence, and I could feel the moment was approaching, the moment when all this tension would either break or boil over. What would happen next? Would this woman's claims hold up? And how would we protect our family and our home from someone who refused to respect boundaries? Just as the tension seemed unbearable, and we braced ourselves for what felt like an inevitable confrontation, a sudden shout came from the side of the street. Another neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, rushed over, holding up her phone with a shaky video. "You need to see this," she said, breathless. The video showed Karen, just a week ago, climbing over the fence of another nearby home and swimming in their pool without permission. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. It was clear trespassing caught on camera. The officers exchanged looks, their faces hardening as they watched the footage. Karen's confident facade cracked for a moment, but then she quickly tried to twist the story again, saying she had every right because the neighborhood was open to all residents. That claim only deepened the mystery. We'd never heard of any such rule, and neither had the other neighbors who had gathered by now. Watching the drama unfold, but the real shock came when one officer pulled out a document from his folder and asked Karen if she was aware that the city had issued a formal complaint against her last month for similar incidents. Apparently, Karen had a long record of these disputes, not just over pools. but over trespassing and harassment in the neighborhood. The situation was escalating far beyond a simple pool gate dispute. I looked down at Jake, whose hands were clenched tightly at his sides. The whole ordeal was weighing on him, and I could see how this unexpected turn was threatening to overwhelm our family. Karen wasn't just an entitled neighbor anymore. She was someone with a pattern, and now the stakes had risen dangerously high. What would happen if the officers decided to press charges? Could this spiral even further? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fence, the neighborhood's quiet calm was shattered. The battle over a locked pool gate had turned into something far more complicated than none of us could predict how it would end. Just as the officers prepared to take more formal action, Karen's phone buzzed loudly in her hand. She glanced down, her expression shifting from defiance to shock. The officer asked if she was okay, and without looking up, she mumbled something about needing to step away. Slowly, she walked toward her car, her usual confidence noticeably shaken. Before she left, she turned back and muttered that she wasn't finished yet, that she had one more thing that would change everything. The neighborhood held its breath. Moments later, Karen returned, holding an old envelope. She handed it to the officer with a shaky hand, insisting it was proof that her family had been part of the original landowners. According to her, this document showed her right to the property, or at least to some shared access. The officers carefully examined the papers. At first glance, it looked official, but then the lead officer frowned and asked a few pointed questions. It didn't take long before they realized the envelope contained a forged deed. The handwriting was off, and official seals were missing. Karen's whole story had been a carefully built house of cards. The officers warned her of the consequences of falsifying documents, and this time it was clear her legal troubles were just beginning. With the truth exposed, Karen finally left, this time without the usual swagger, and the neighborhood slowly settled back into quiet. Jake breathed easier, knowing he hadn't done anything wrong. We double-checked our locks, grateful for the safety measures we had in place all along. But just as we thought it was over, a knock came at the door late that night. It was one of the officers, holding a new letter, this time from the city council. They'd received an anonymous complaint about our pool fence not meeting new safety codes. The battle wasn't quite finished yet. The question was, who had sent it? And why was this conflict far from over? After that tense night, things finally started to settle down. The officers reassured us that Karen's threats and forged documents wouldn't hold up in court. The city council's letter about the pool fence was a standard safety check, nothing more, but it reminded us how important it was to keep our home secure and up to code. We arranged for an inspection and made a few small updates to the fence, just to be safe. Our neighbors came around more often after that, some apologizing for not speaking up sooner, others sharing their own odd encounters with Karen. It became clear that she had caused trouble in more than one home, trying to push her way into private spaces and stirring conflict. But instead of letting it divide the community, this strange situation brought us closer together. We started talking more openly, keeping an eye out for each other, and rebuilding trust where it had been shaken. For Jake, this experience was a tough lesson in standing up for what's right even when it's scary. He learned that sometimes doing the right thing means facing unexpected challenges, and that safety and respect have to come first. I'm proud of how he handled everything with calm and honesty. Looking back, the whole incident taught me how easily things can spiral when boundaries aren't respected. It also showed how important it is to protect your family and property, but to do so with patience and understanding. Karen's story was complicated, and while her behavior was wrong, it reminded us that sometimes people act out because of their own struggles, though that doesn't excuse crossing lines. In the end, our home remained a safe place, and our family stronger for having faced this unusual challenge together. And as for Karen, well, she moved away shortly after the police warned her about legal consequences. Sometimes a locked fence is more than just metal and wood it's about keeping. Peace and respect in a neighborhood that we all call home.